Today we have a subject that people don't really like to talk about, and it's about giving. Although we're in a season of giving coming up, but people don't really like giving in many ways. But here we're going to look at it from a biblical example of the Old Testament. In verse 4 of our reading in Hebrews, we read, "By faith Abel offered God a better sacrifice than Cain did." And Hebrews is talking not about presents and the things that we're planning in the next few weeks, but it's talking about giving an offering or giving to the Lord. And the question that we have for us today is, does God care about our giving? Is there a right way and a wrong way to give? We're not just talking about financial giving. A lot of people, a lot of churches will say, the minister's looking for money again. But it is a very important thing for us to think about. And it's more than just giving our money. It's about giving ourselves and the attitude that we give. And the story of Cain and Abel does help to illustrate this. And yes, there is a right way to give, and there's a wrong way to give. And yes, God does care about how we give. And what is the right way to give of anything that we have in our lives? In verse 4, it tells us that the right way to give is by faith. And we're going to talk today about what it means to give to God by faith. And we need to think about what it means in the context of Cain and Abel, because that helps to illustrate what it means to give. And on the surface, we as modern people might be thinking, why did Abel give God a better sacrifice than Cain? Why did he do it? Why was it seen as better? They both presented offerings to God, but the Bible tells us that Abel's was better or superior to Cain's. Well, the short answer to that is because Abel presented his offering by faith. But what does it mean in this context? Why was Abel's offering different? Why was it that Abel's offering demonstrated faith that was lacking in Cain's offering? In order to understand these questions, we looked at Genesis chapter 4. And we also look at these kind of aspects of what it means to give. And we read Genesis chapter 4 earlier. And we saw there was a number of differences between Cain and his offering to the Lord and what Abel did. You know, we're told that Abel kept flocks and Cain worked the soil, and Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering, but Abel brought the fat portions from some of the livestock. And was it a difference in the type of offering? No, because both of these boys worked in very different kinds of things. You know, one boy worked in plants, and the other boy worked in animals, to put it crudely. And was it a difference in the attitude? Maybe. Some commentators say that Abel brought his offering willingly, while Cain brought his offering with a bad attitude. Thus they say Abel presented his offering by faith, while Cain didn't. And attitude is a very important thing. That's important when we're giving to God. God doesn't want us to give to him reluctantly or begrudgingly, but rather we should be cheerful givers. It's a bit like if you get a bill through the door. You don't necessarily pay it cheerfully, do we? Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. Depends what it is. But again, it's about giving to the Lord here. And when we read through Genesis chapter 4, if you do that in your own time, you see that Cain definitely has an attitude problem. But the text never says that Cain came to God with that bad attitude. Cain's bad attitude in the text does not really come to the surface until after God looks with favour on Abel's offering and rejects Cain and his offering. It's only then that we're told that Cain became angry and his face was downcast. And maybe It was because Abel offered God his first portion. That's what it really is about. Abel offered God his first portion. Cain waited to see, is there any better offers here? Right, we'll just give that to God. And that's what it was all about, isn't it? The first portion of Abel went to God. And thinking about the application for this, what does it mean to give God our first portion? It's a concept which is alien to us, but in the Bible you get the concept of firstborn or first fruits. And God commanded his people to present the firstborn of all their flocks and herds and the first fruits of their soil as an offering to him. In Deuteronomy 12 we read, "Bring your burnt offerings and sacrifices, your tithes and special gifts, what you are vowed to give, and your freewill offerings, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks." In Deuteronomy we are told in chapter 18, "You are to give the first fruits of your grain, new wine and oil, and the first wool from the shearing of your sheep." So this is a clear biblical principle. The first portion belongs to God. Well, actually, the whole portion belongs to God, really. It's all God's after all. But presenting the first portion to God is a way of acknowledging God's ownership of all the rest. Thinking about it contemporary setting, I remember in my childhood church, there were some very old curtains that used to hang in the church hall. And it turned out that these were curtains that somebody had given the church that no one really wanted. And they just hung there. They didn't really fit very well in the hall, but they looked very dated. They weren't the nicest. Some were too big and some were too small. And then later on there was new curtains in the hall, but then there was someone else's curtains and they had a rip in it, and they didn't look very nice either. They didn't actually match the paint at all that had been painted up. And then before lockdown I was in a funeral at Lindsay Union, and there was a tea in the old hall, and yes, there was a new set. Well, it wasn't a new set, it was new to the church, a new set of manky curtains again. And you get that situation where people were giving, but they were giving not really the first fruits. And you know, there's all sorts of debates you could have about giving, but really if you wanted to give something to somebody or something else, you really want to be giving something nice and not be known as the person who gave the manky curtains that were stuck there for another couple of decades. You know, that's maybe a contemporary example of it. But thinking back to the Bible, thinking back to the Old Testament, one of the reasons why God took the lives of the firstborn sons of Egypt was this. God was demonstrating that rather than the false Egyptian gods that claimed to exist, that he was saying that he had true ownership over everything in Egypt. He was challenging the people, saying, you know, look, your Egyptian gods don't count here. The firstborn, everything belongs to me. And for even though God spared the firstborn of Israel, God still required the Israelites to redeem their firstborn sons with a portion of silver. Why? Because the firstborn belonged to God in recognition of God's supreme ownership. What else does it mean for us? It means giving God your first and your best, and not the leftovers. In Exodus chapter 23, verse 19, it says, "Bring the best of your first fruits of your soil to the house of the Lord your God." And why does it say to bring the best? Because what you bring to God reflects what you think of God, and God deserves the very best. And remember, Genesis tells us in chapter 4 that Abel brought the fat portions from some of the firstborn of the flock. The fat portions were the best portions, the tastiest ones, the tastiest morsels to have. and Abel brought to God the first. And giving God the first portion means giving God our first and our best. The next aspect we see is that it means giving God the first tenth of our income. And if giving of the first portion devolved into giving of a tithe. It's a thing that we find very difficult to understand. And some people have different financial situations, and we have to reflect that too. But in 2 Chronicles chapter 31, it talks about how the Israelites gave their first fruits, and they brought a tithe of everything. And there was so much left over that they piled the surplus in heaps. And this is the principle of giving, which continued throughout the Old Testament and it continued amongst many people today. When God's people give as God directs, there will always be plenty of money to do God's work. And the Bible says that the first portion begins with a tithe. Some people have the idea that tithing is the end point, and that somehow you try and work your way up to the tithe, and then you give as God requires. But the tithe is really the beginning, it's our starting point in our giving. The first tenth already belongs to God. It's your first and your best. But when you grow in Christ in this whole area of giving, then we start to think about our priorities, to think about God's priorities. And that's why we speak about tithes and offerings. We bring to God our tithe and we bring to God our offering in keeping with our faith and our income. And this principle of tithing was given by God in the Old Testament, and it wasn't really revoked in the New Testament at all. What does it mean to give your God your first portion? It means giving God the first and the best, to give him the priorities in our lives. We don't give God the leftovers or the things that we throw to the dog under the table. And then I want to have a look as how does giving to God the first portion demonstrate our faith? We've seen why did Abel offer a better sacrifice than Cain. We've also seen that what it means to give God the first portion. And now we look at how does giving God the first portion demonstrates our faith. Well, the Bible teaches us that giving to God is part of our worship. It's how we honour God in our lives. Sometimes we think of worship as being restricted to church. And in some contemporary churches, you get people who say that they're worship leaders or worship ministers. And they say we're going to have a time of worship. And I remember someone says to me they've got a great worship leader. And I said to them, that means you've got someone who leads the singing, isn't it? And I didn't really like that answer. But, that's effectively what worship is. It's beyond the singing part, in the same way that I usually give Jane the hymns, usually on a Friday now. I used to give it on a Wednesday. But now it's usually evolved to a Friday. I usually give it a theme. But Jane, in our own time, looks at incidental music to fit and everything else, and it magically all appears on a Sunday because Jane is able to go away and think about these things. I'm just going to say it just happened by random. But no, she does put a lot of thought into that, and that's very important in our music and in our sung worship. But the thing is that worship is more than just the singing bit. I hate it when you go to a more contemporary church and they say we're going to have a time of worship. It means you're going to sing for a while, or sometimes in some churches you just go there and you hear someone else sing for a while. But whole of life is worship, and we honour God with all our life. In Proverbs chapter 3 we're told to honour the Lord with our wealth and the first fruit of our crops. And then your barns will be filled to overflowing, and your vats will brim with new wine. Giving to God is a matter of worship and honour. And it's such an important issue that Jesus identified money as a major competitor to God in our lives. As we know in Matthew chapter 6, Jesus said, you cannot serve both God and money. Jesus says, how you give reveals your heart. Do we store up our treasures in heaven, or do we store it up on earth? He also says, where your treasure is, there's your heart. And ultimately, it depends on our priorities. It depends where our heart is. Do we want to see the gospel go forth? Then we will move to give in so many different kinds of ways. Sometimes giving is of our money. Sometimes giving is of our time. Sometimes giving is being there. And a lot of people don't have time to be there with people, because being there with people is very difficult. And that's equally as important in our giving too. I remember someone saying to me, I think I said it in Moncrieff last week, you can say to somebody, hello, how are you? But the answer you really want is, I'm fine. You don't really want the real answer, do you? And if someone says, no, I didn't sleep very well last night, and I've got a giant wart on my toe and it's going to get frozen off next week, and I'm a wee bit scared about going to the doctor for that, and I had the runs the week before, so I'm worried what I'm going to have in the supermarket this week. Sometimes people need to get that off their chest, don't they? And actually, it can be a sacrifice of time by giving of our time to listen to people. And that is equally as important as giving of our money. And that's something else we can think about. Maybe some of you are just old pensions. You might call yourselves that. I'm not saying you're old or not. But sometimes what we can give in this age that some of us may fall into is of time, is of wisdom, is of listening. And that's equally as important, because there's not many people willing to listen these days to people. But what do we find here? We've recognised that God is a source of all our blessings. We acknowledge that God is the owner of all we have, and we trust God's promises to provide all our needs. These are the aspects of how God and how we give to him our first portion demonstrates our faith. And what's the application that we see here? What kind of application do we see here? Well, there's three very quick things that we can do to give God our first portion today. We can give God the first and best of all our lives, not just our finances. God demands and deserves the first and best part of our life. As it says in one of the hymns, love so amazing, so divine, demands my life, my soul, my all. We give to God the best part of our day, the best part and first part of our thoughts, and of our time, our talents, and our money. What else should we do? We should budget our life around our giving, not our giving around our lives. When we think about giving to God, not just in terms of money, but also in terms of our time. Do we put God first on that list? Sometimes, even for a lot of people, when it comes to time, they'll say, I'm not going to go to church this week because I need to do something else. That may well be the case. It's often the case we have to look after people. Sometimes we've been ill and whatever else. But sometimes, as we think about Sunday being the first day of our week, it's a day that we give our first time of worship together to God. And as a sacrifice of time too, to be with others. How do we know how much to give? We pray about it. We think about what God is commanding us and leading us to give. And also there's some people who give too much, and that has to be thought about too. There are some people who give too much in all aspects, and that's something I might have to think about, is reviewing their giving as well. What else do we need to think about? Finally, we set aside God's portion first before we spend anything else. Separate what we give to God first. Think about what we can do each week in the church, in our Christian lives, to help others before we start to think about our own choices. In closing, this may seem like a message about giving. It's not at all related to target letters going out. It's just the way the target letters fail. But it's a message really not about giving so much, but about God's sovereignty and about the lordship of Jesus. It's a message about faith as well. Abel shows us that giving God our first portion, our first and our best, is about living by faith. And God gave his first and his best for us. In John 3:16 we read that God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, his first and his best, so that whoever believes in him will not perish, but have eternal life. And God is asking us to give him our first and our best. And in Hebrews, we read that Abel offered up a better sacrifice than Cain did. Genesis 4 says that Cain brought some of the fruits, but Abel brought the fat portions. And the Lord looked in favour on Abel. So as we think about our giving, do we commit to our giving in faith? Do we give him our first and our best? And the first and best of our lives. Jane is now going to play for us The Spirit Lives to Set Us Free, which is 664 in the hymn books. 664, The Spirit Lives to Set Us Free.